Today's subject is a very, very important topic from Vedas, from the Vedic devotional tradition, the ninefold devotion. Technically, it is known as Navadha Bhakti. Navadha means ninefold. It's a very, very celebrated path of devotional practice in Vedic spiritual tradition. There are two main schools of ninefold path of devotion. One school of this devotional practice is explained in the great devotional classic known as Bhagavata Purana. A slightly different approach is found in another important work which is known as Adhyatma Ramayana. These are the two famous works in which ninefold path of devotion is elaborately described. The story background is this. In Adhyatma Ramayana, you find the great incarnation of God, Rama, describing this ninefold path to a poor woman devotee with the name Shabari. Shabari is the very embodiment of all that you normally associate in a great devotee: humility, purity, complete surrender. Shabari is considered to be an archetypal devotee, almost like some of the women Christian saints of Catholic mystical tradition. The other school of ninefold path of devotion is explained in the Bhagavata Purana, as I said earlier. But of these two, the later version is more popular, and it has been commented upon by innumerable great devotional philosophers in subsequent centuries. So here I am planning to deal with this ninefold path as found in the Bhagavata Purana. A genesis of this can be found in the Gita. A hint. In the Gita, in the 12th chapter, which is known as Bhakti Yoga, there are 4 verses in which the great teacher, Lord Krishna, expounds 4 levels of devotional life. 4 levels in the evolution of an ideal devotee. If those who are interested may remember, from 8th to 11th verse, in 4 verses. In the 8th verse, Lord Krishna says that the characteristic of a devotee of the highest type is that he will be living constantly in the memory of God. And God also takes his residence in the devotee's heart. So there is an element of complete identity between the devotee and God. This is the stage of the highest evolution in devotional life. That is in the 8th verse. In the 9th verse, Lord Krishna says, this is not easy for all. So what about those who cannot always put their faith in God? The 8th verse, for those who are interested, we can remember, Mayi eva mana atatsva mayi buddhim nivesaya nivasishyasi mayi eva ata urdham na samsaya. This is the verse. The meaning is this. The Lord says that the highest devotee has surrendered his mind and intellect to me, and he will live in me. And he also hints that God will take his residence in the devotee's heart. In the next verse, in the 9th verse, Sri Krishna says, this is not easy for all. Because normally our mind is distracted in all directions. Mind is full of conflicting thoughts, distractions, and agitations. So you cannot always concentrate your mind on God. So what about those who have not reached the highest level of spiritual evolution? Here Lord Krishna says they can slowly practice concentration of devotional practice. They can slowly try to keep their mind engaged in the thought of God. Now, how do we do that? You hear so many things which may not be always helpful in spiritual life, which may take your mind away from God. So, you try to divert your mind towards words which will remind you of God. So this is the first path. Sravanam means hearing. And then you try to sing hymns in praise of the Lord. In Sanskrit it is called kirtanam, means singing hymns, devotional songs. And then remember God. Smaranam means try to establish a link between your day-to-day activities, whether you're working in an office, working in a university, or in a farm, whatever may be. In all these activities, which normally may create distraction in the mind, try to bring in the thought of God. It is called remembrance, or in Sanskrit it is called Smaranam. This is so hearing, singing hymns when you get time, or even if you don't get time when you are engaged in different activities, mentally try to establish a link between your mind and spiritual ideas. This is possible by silently remembering or verbally singing hymns. And then consider all your activities, physical activity, mental activity, that could be a thought, or intellectual activity, whatever may be. So try to look upon all these activities as an act of worship of the Lord. The technical name used is Padasevanam, which literally means serving the feet. The idea is this: the entire creation is one with the Lord. So Pada means a part, 1/4. So the entire creation, the whole humanity is a part of the Lord. So whatever you do is an act of service to the Lord. It is not an act of service to human beings. It's an act of service to God. This is a fourth way of bringing the mind in close proximity with spiritual ideas. You may remember in Swami Vivekananda's lectures, the inspired talks, and in Practical Vedanta, he expresses the same idea. The greatest act of worship of the Lord is a service done to the man living next door to you. And then in another context, Swamiji says, the human mind is a Taj Mahal of temples. Taj Mahal is symbolic of beauty, sublimity, architectural grandeur. The highest reach of architectural perfection. Now, human mind is the most beautiful and the most sublime place of Lord. So, every act becomes an act of worship. This is the fourth term used, Padasevanam. Fifth one is Archanam. Archanam actually means doing worship, ritualistic worship. You may pray, prayer is a worship. Formal worship is also a worship. reading sacred books with great concentration and a sense of sanctity is also worship. So, and then Vandanam is the next term used. Vandanam actually means paying obeisance. A real devotee will be humble without being a hypocrite. So, interestingly, in some of the commentaries on devotional classics, a clear distinction is made between the real humility of a devotee of God and the diplomatic fineness of a trained, programmed air hostess, hotel receptionist, or maybe medical representative. So a real devotee will be naturally humble, because when he's humble in his response, in his interaction with others, he doesn't bring himself down. He's humble because he sees, he experiences the presence of the Lord within him, and he also experiences the presence of the Lord in other beings. So it's a kind of humility. So it's the term used, humility, mean you pay obeisance. So sometimes we marvel at the psychological insight of the great commentators who have written commentaries on these verses. See, the commentators say it's the naturalness is more important than assumed humility. That is the English translation of a technical Sanskrit phrase used in the commentary. Being natural to oneself, and humility based on our own natural understanding that God is present everywhere. This is the sixth one. So then, Sravanam, Kirtanam, Smaranam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasim. I shall recite the sloka for your convenience. I shall continue this. This verse occurs in the Bhagavata Purana for those who are interested. The verse is this: Sravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnoho, Smaranam, Padasevanam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakhyam, Atma Nivedanam, Idi Pumsapyuda Vishnu, Bhaktische Navalakshana, Kriyade Bhagavat Yadhva, Tanmanne Adhidam Uttamam. This is the context. I shall explain one after another. Now, Vandanam is again is paying obeisance. Then Dasya means an expression of servitude. Interestingly, you find identical concepts in the medieval Christian mystical tradition also. You consider yourself to be the servant of God. That is one. And then next one is the next one is Sakhya, means you consider yourself to be a friend of God, a comrade, and look upon God as your comrade, which brings you into a sense of, into intimate terms in your relationship with God. And then the last, ninth one is Atma Nivedanam, complete surrender. This is the last stage. So these are the 9 stages. I shall once more explain. The first one is hearing. The second one is singing hymns. Then the third one is Smaranam, that is remembrance. And then the fourth one is serving the Lord and serving His creation. Because when we look upon God as the creator of the entire humanity, then we cannot hate other human beings. Hating the father and hating his children won't go together. No father would be happy if you love him and express your love for him and your hostility towards his children. He won't be much amused. So, Sravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, Padasevanam. Archana means ritualistic worship, any kind of external form of devotional exercise. Vandana means paying obeisance. Then dasya means an attitude of servantship. You consider yourself as God's servant, and whatever you do is an act of service to the Lord. Somewhat different from Padasevana we mentioned earlier. Because a devotee who looks upon himself as God's servant feels a tremendous self-confidence. And towards the end of Swami Vivekananda's career, when some of his own fellow disciples expressed concern about his new Vedantic ideas, then Swamiji makes a statement, "What can I do? I am a tool in his hands and his servant." So that gives you tremendous self-confidence. You are the servant of the Lord. So then Sakhyam means comradeship, and then complete surrender. Now, in our devotional literature, there are a number of examples given who fully exemplify these devotional ideals in their life. The first one, as I mentioned earlier, is Sravanam, listening. One example is, in fact, a very important character of the Bhagavata Purana itself. The story goes like this. Now, Bhagavata is an exposition of the highest spiritual truths by a great sage who was Shuka to his disciple Parikshit. The story goes like this. Parikshit was a great king, but by somehow in an unguarded moment, he happened to do something which was a heinous crime. He was going about hunting in the forests. In those days, it was the duty of great kings to kill wild animals, mind you, thousands of years back, when there were too many wild animals for human beings to live with. So it was the duty of great kings to reduce the population of ferocious animals so that the saints and sages doing meditation in forest hermitages could live happily there, and villages also won't be molested by these foraging wild ferocious animals. So this great king Parikshit went about hunting in the forest, and he became very much exhausted and tired, and on his way he found a small hermitage. He entered the hermitage. A great aged sage was meditating. He was completely immersed in meditation. The king asked for water, but the sage didn't reply because he was completely immersed in meditation. He didn't know that a stranger had entered the hermitage. Then the king, he was hungry and thirsty, so he thought maybe the sage is a bit headstrong, arrogant. He is not showing any concern for the guest who has entered his hermitage. And what he did, he came out, and there was a dead serpent lying near the forest. He brought it with his bow and put it around the neck of the sage. This is the story. And he went his way. After some time, if the sage's name is Shamika, that is to Purani, we need not very important. And after some time, the sage's son came. He returned to the hermitage. And he found, to his shock, that his father is sitting there immersed in meditation with a dead serpent lying on his neck. He was shocked, and in his anger, he cursed the man who did this heinous crime. He said, whoever it may be, the one who has committed this heinous crime will die within 7 days. And he said, a mighty serpent will bite him. He will be poisoned and he will die. So you imagine, this king had only 168 hours to live, 24 into 7. 168 hours. Now, what will be the psychology of a man who comes to know that he has only 168 hours to live? When the sage opened his eyes, when he came to know what really happened, he was very much upset. He scolded his young son for what he did. You did a terrible thing. The king was a great man. Parikshit, the king, was a very great man in other respects. This was perhaps the only bad deed, evil deed that he ever did in his life, this particular incident. Otherwise, he was known for his noble virtues, qualities, and other great kingly virtues. So the sage scolded his son, and he sent his emissaries to the king. Unfortunately, my son, because after all, the son of a sage. So remember, sages were not monks. You have to remember. Sometimes, there's a point to be remembered is, all these sages were not necessarily monks. They were not mendicants. In ancient times, during the early Vedic age, it was a custom for learned, virtuous householders to leave their homes when they got old, and they will leave their homes, go to a forest, stay in a hermitage, and spend the rest of their lifetime in meditation and contemplation on God. And very often, their children also will accompany them to their forest hermitages to help them, to serve them, to cook for them, to collect firewood and other things for the spiritual practices, the fire sacrifice and all that, the homa and all that. This was the common practice. So this is the cultural scene that you have to keep in mind. So anyhow, the sage was very much upset, and he sent his emissary who went and informed the king that unfortunately you are being cursed to be beaten by a snake, and you have only 168 hours to live. Now look at the king's character. This man, when he came to know, suddenly he was filled with remorse, repentance. He said, what a terrible crime I have committed, so I deserve this punishment. That was his response. And what he did, he decided to leave the palace, the city, and he wanted to spend the rest of his lifetime, which means 168 hours, in contemplation of God. That was his. So he left his kingdom. He declared his son as the heir apparent, his Janamejaya, in the name you find in the Bhagavata Purana. And he came to the banks of Ganga. So a number of other saints and sages are also gathered there. And among them, there was the great saint of those days. His name is Shuka. Shuka also had come. When Shuka himself appeared in front of him, this king puts one question to Shuka, the great sage. And the entire devotional classic is a reply, an answer to this question. The question is this: what should a dying man do? How should you face your death? Which indirectly means how should you live your life in this world. Both are equally, because for a wise man, life is a preparation to leave this world with a smile in your face and with godly thoughts in your heart. That is a central theme of this devotional classic. So when Shuka himself appeared before the king puts a question, Atha prichami samsiddhim yoginam paramam gurum purusasyeha yadkaryam mriyamanasya sarvadha. Yet kartavyam madho japyam, yes kartavyam nriviprabho, smartavyam bhajaneyam va, bruhi yadva viparyam. I should translate, you need not worry about the verse, I am just quoting for this. The question is this. I want to ask you one question. What should a man do when death is staring at him on his face? Whom should he meditate upon? How should he go about his duties and responsibilities? What should he meditate upon, contemplate on? How should he interact with the other fellow beings? What should be his philosophy of life if you are sure that death is staring at you? Now remember, death is perhaps the most certain reality of human existence. But that's the only thing which man always forgets every moment of his life. If there is anything certain in this world, it is death. It is not, at the same time, it is something that we always forget. Now, this question may appear to be a bit pessimistic, but the great saint who answers this question presents a great positive philosophy before Parikshit. The central philosophy is this: you can live a very happy life in this world, very successful, very happy, contented life. But you should always remember that everything in this world is subject to change and therefore not eternal. But this life itself becomes a festival, a celebration, a joyful celebration, if you can combine your activities with the godly ideas in mind. And for this, the first step is listening. That is called Sravanam. So, Parikshit is the greatest example of a person who transcended death, who lived a happy, joyful life because he knew the hard reality, but he was never bothered about it. For him, life itself became a celebration, a joyful experience. So, for 7 days, the great saint Shuka expounded the life and teachings of Lord Krishna to the great king. On the 7th day, he passed away. So, the devotional classics and devotional philosophers give the example of King Parikshit as the archetypal devotee who reached the highest spiritual goal of his life just by listening. So the first path is Sravanam, means listening. Listening to good, great, holy, spiritual ideas, which will naturally permeate our mind. If our mind is ready, listening takes you straight to experience. If our mind is ready. If our mind is not ready, then listening may not have immediate effect. But it will have its effect, but not immediately. You have to keep listening continuously every day. And listening also includes indirectly reading. Listening, Sravanam, listening also means feeding your mind with godly thoughts, spiritually elevating thoughts, so that your mind becomes ready to combine life and spirituality and lead a happy, contented life. So Parikshit, King Parikshit, is the grandest example of one who could face the hard reality of being left with only 168 hours to live, but who could lead a happy and joyful life. The second path, as I mentioned, is singing praises, singing songs in praise of the Lord, hymns. The example given by the great devotional philosophers is the great teacher of Bhagavata Purana himself, Shuka. You can find this man, this great saint, he had no home and he had no friends. In other words, the whole world was his home and entire humanity were his friends. And he spent all his lifetime singing songs in praise of the Lord. So, the presence of the Lord was not just a belief for him, not an idea for him. It became a matter of his daily experience. In every activity, he felt, he experienced the presence of the Lord. So Shuka, the great teacher of this devotion classic, Bhagavata, himself is the archetypal example of a great devotee who reached the highest spiritual perfection through singing songs in praise of the Lord. Then the third path is, as I said, remembrance, Smaranam, remembrance. In fact, the verse which I recited earlier, in which all the 9 paths are outlined, was taught by Prahlada. Prahlada is supposed to be the great example of a great devotee who reached the highest spiritual goal through remembrance. Incidentally, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa says in this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna that Prahlada is the greatest example of an ideal devotee. Because after all, he was a small boy, and this is the son of a man of demoniacal character, diabolical character. And as a small boy, he was trained to do everything which a devotee should not do. But he did not learn them. His father employed teachers to teach him what a devotee should never do. But the world alone is real. The purpose of human existence is to enjoy this world. Such were the teachings given to Prahlada by his teachers, who were employed by his own father. But Prahlada only learned from them what not to do. So he says, in fact, this verse which I recited earlier, Sravanam Kirtanam Vishnoho Smaranam Padasevanam Archanam Vandanam Dasyam Sakhyam Atmanivedanam Idi Pumsapida Vishnu Bhaktisched Navalakshana Kriyede Bhagavat Yadhva Tanmanne Adhidam Uttamam. This verse was taught by Prahlada to his friends and also to his own father and also to his teachers. He says, I consider him as a well-refined, well-educated man or woman who has practiced this 9-fold path of devotion. That's a real sign of true education. That is the statement which Prahlada says. In fact, Navalakshana Bhakti, this 9-fold path as given in the Bhagavata Purana, was the teaching of this small boy, mind you, not a young great sage. He's a small boy, because he was tortured by his father for being a devotee of God, for not doing evil things, for not learning evil things from his teachers. For that he was punished by his father, who was himself an evil person. Hiranyakasipu. That story, I don't want to go into those mythological stories. Stories by themselves may be mythological in nature, but behind the story there is a greater story, the real meaning, significance, and message of the story. The message of the story is this: Prahlada always remembered God. In fact, his problem was how to forget, because every moment, whatever he did, that's Prahlada himself says, in sleep, while eating, while walking, every activity for him became an act of worship. Every word for him became a hymn. Every word became a hymn, a song in praise of the Lord. Every thought became meditation. Every movement became an act of going around the Lord, circumambulation. That's what Prahlada himself says. So his whole existence, in other words, became an experience of his identity with the all-pervading reality, God himself. So Prahlada is considered to be the archetypal devotee who reached the highest of devotional experience through constant remembrance. Then next one is Pada Sevanam, that I have already explained elaborately earlier. And then worship. In the devotional classic itself, there is the picture of a great king who was an embodiment of formal worship. And in this classic, there are sometimes some stories which reveal the true effect of even a little bit of spiritual practice, either listening, singing songs in praise of the Lord, remembering, or formal worship. And that story is this: there is a character in this devotional classic. In fact, he doesn't belong to any of these categories. He led a very good life when he was very young. His name is Ajamila. You can find in the devotion classic. He was born in a good, pious family, and he was trained to lead a very pious, God-fearing life. But when he became young, he had a deviation. He became a hedonist, became a bohemian, and got involved in bad company, and he started leading a very, very vicious, unspiritual life. And it so happened that he was about to face his death. But he had a son. The son's name was, in Sanskrit, Narayana. Narayana is one of the synonyms of Vishnu, Krishna, in the devotional tradition of Vedanta, Vedic spiritual heritage. His son's name was Narayana. So this man was about to die. But at that time, it's a mythological story. You should remember, the stories are mythological in nature. The author of all these stories, Vyasa himself says, the stories have a story behind them. That's a central message that is related to our day-to-day spiritual life, that message. So, when he was about to die, his senses became weak, body became weak. When your body and senses become weak, and when your mind also feels the total helplessness of leaving this world, then you are in a terrible condition. Those who have led a happy spiritual life can move from this world to the next as moving from one room to another. But those who don't have much to remember in terms of spiritual or ethical life activities may face a sense of helplessness. So that was the condition, that the position of this man, Ajamila. He had become old. Suddenly he remembered. He had a good upbringing. He was taught to lead a spiritual life when he was a young boy. Then he had a deviation, and then he led a most unspiritual bohemian life. Now his life is coming to an end. His body is weak, senses are weak, mind is in total confusion. But then he called his son. And the young boy crawled to him. The son's name was Narayana, which name is a synonym of God. When he suddenly uttered this name, the son came to him, but he also remembered the early training he had received as a young boy. So all the spiritual ideas that he had imbibed as a young boy, when he was growing up as a young boy, the training he had received from his teachers and his parents, who were virtuous people, suddenly surfaced, and he remembered, And immediately he had a sudden change. Though actually when he used the word Narayana, he didn't intend to call on God. He was trying to call his son to his side. But that name, by coincidence, happened to be the same as the name of God. So this coincidence suddenly brought forth the memories of his early days, when he was trained to lead the life of a virtuous man, when he was a young boy. This memory suddenly surfaced, and he had the memory of God, and he could leave this world with spiritual ideas, the memory of God in his heart. That caused his liberation from the cycle of life and death. That's how the author of this devotion classic explains the effect of remembrance even by coincidence. So, and then the author goes on saying, even if you practice a little bit of spirituality, either by listening to spiritual ideas or trying to imbibe spiritual ideas by reading with concentration and a sense of sanctity and devotion, or doing anything that's good and noble, even the least bit of spiritual practice will leave its mark in our memory, and that will become the cause of liberation. So, that's why in the 6th chapter of Gita, Arjuna puts a very important question before Krishna. See, Krishna teaches him how to meditate, how to practice devotion, how to lead a spiritual life. Then Arjuna puts a very practical question before Krishna. What happens to those who try their best but do not succeed and die out before they succeed, before they reach their goal? What about those who do not succeed, who die away before they succeed, before they attain a spiritual goal? And then Arjuna compares, don't you think that their fate will be like the fate of a piece of cloud that gets separated from the mass of clouds which are floating in the sky? Say a small piece of cloud which gets separated, isolated from the mass of cloud, will be lost by the powerful wind that's blowing. But the mass of cloud may start floating, continue floating for some time. So don't you think the fate of a devotee who tries to practice spirituality but who do not succeed in it will be as helpless as the fate of a cloud, a piece of cloud? Then Krishna says no. He gives a great promise. He says, even a little bit of practice will be deposited in the spiritual bank. It will remain there. And in the next life, you can draw your check. So don't think that you have only one existence. The problem is, people who are trained in a tradition which teaches that you have only one existence, one chance. And at the end of the journey, either you go to hell or heaven. Either eternal damnation or permanent residence in heaven. Those who are trained in this theological doctrine won't understand the significance of Lord Krishna's promise. Lord Krishna's promise is this: even a little bit of practice which you do in this life, at least for half an hour, will remain in your name. It will be deposited in the spiritual bank. And later, in the next life, by coincidence, if you happen to come in contact with such spiritual ideas, immediately you will connect. A link will be established with your mind and those spiritual ideas. That's how sometimes you feel, suddenly you happen to go to a spiritual lecture and you feel drawn towards it. Because sometime in the past, maybe hundreds of years back, you have imbibed these ideas. And then suddenly, in this life, when you re-establish a link, the connection takes place. That's the promise which Sri Krishna gives in the 6th chapter. Ayati, that's what the term which Arjuna uses. Somebody who has not fully succeeded in controlling their senses. And then he has deviated from the path of devotion and happened to get lost in this life. So Krishna gives a great promise. Even a little bit of spiritual practice need not necessarily be meditation. If you have listened to one lecture for half an hour, if you have read one holy book and imbibed a few holy thoughts, or if you have concentrated, or if you have discussed some holy thoughts, that will remain in your mind, which is technically called a chittam, which is a bag in which all the thoughts and impressions and tendencies are accumulated. And the next life, when you happen to come in contact with such ideas, suddenly the link is re-established. So that's a great promise which Lord Krishna gives. Nothing will be lost, you are never late. In fact, that is the central message of the devotional classic of Bhagavata Purana. In a very limited span of time, I have tried to give an outline of this ninefold path. A similar teaching is found in the Adhyatma Ramayana, in which Lord Rama teaches ninefold path of devotion to a great woman devotee who is known as Shabari. So I have given a brief outline. Maybe in some other lectures in future I will try to give more ideas related to this. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.